Are the Liberals attempting to rewrite history in order to further their persecution of lawful gun owners? What if I told you that the way they're doing this is blatantly illegal, and it won't even matter that it is? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today is January 1st, 2025. Happy New Year's, everyone. And the Liberals have started their gun control year off with a bang. I found this story today on thegunblog.ca's X page, where they posted about a new order in council that came out on December 16th, published in the Gazette on the 1st of January 2025. The post already has several thousand views and plenty of comments from people ranging from confusion to speculation as to what exactly this new order in council does. Because what it actually does is seemingly innocuous, yet rather insidious. Now, before I go any further, I do want to clarify, this is a different kind of order in council from what we're normally used to. This is not another firearm ban as we're used to seeing from these OICs. This OIC is not even from the criminal code, which is what lets them do their gun bans in the first place. This is an OIC from the Firearms Act, so it does still pertain to us, but I don't want to set up to scare anyone. There are no new gun bans today, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. Now, that being said, I don't think this OIC is exactly harmless either. So this is the new order in council, and it's titled Regulations Repealing the Firearms Records Regulations, and it sets out to do one very specific thing. It repeals the Firearms Record Regulations. Go figure. So before we get into this order in council, we need to understand what it seeks to repeal. This is the Firearms Records Regulations. It was brought in by order in council in 2014 by the Harper government as a direct result of the fiasco caused by the RCMP reclassifying a few firearms to prohibited status. These firearms were specifically the CZ-858 and Swiss Arms Classic Green Rifles. The Harper government implemented a number of different legislative and regulatory changes aimed at allowing these firearms to continue to be owned and used due to the inherent unfairness of the reclassification by the RCMP. And one of the things they did was to enact the Firearms Record Regulations. Now, this particular regulation doesn't appear to be aimed at fixing the issues directly related to the RCMP's reclassification, but rather at preventing another such travesty from happening in the future. And specifically, they require any firearm classification determinations which are made by the Registrar under the Firearms Act to be recorded, and that such records cannot be changed any later than 1 year after said determinations, and that these records cannot ever be destroyed. So, on its surface, one might think that these regulations instituted by Harper were aimed at preventing the RCMP and the Canadian Firearms Program from changing their mind regarding firearms classification. But that's actually not really the case. The astute among you have probably already noticed, but this order pertains to the Firearms Act and to the Registrar. The Registrar, primarily, administers the Canadian Firearms Registry through the Firearms Act. However, the RCMP classification in the Firearms Reference Table is done through interpreting the definitions in the Criminal Code and implemented by the Specialized Firearms Support Services, the SFSS. If you watched my CCFR vs. Canada series, then you'll know that we're currently awaiting a ruling from the Federal Court of Appeals as to whether or not the RCMP should even have the authority to do this in the first place. But this is further evidence to suggest that the Firearms Reference Table can't really be considered to be not legally binding. After all, a mere change in the classification solely from the RCMP was enough to make thousands of Canadians into criminals overnight. So that feels pretty legally binding to me. And you might be able to argue that they simply had it wrong initially and that this changes them eventually getting it right and complying with the lawful statutes of the land. And sure, fair enough, that could be true. But then that would mean that their initial incorrect determination was enough to completely supersede existing statutes and regulations. And again, that hardly sounds not legally binding to me. So the Specialized Firearms Support Service and the Registrar of Firearms both work as part of the Canadian Firearms Program, but their respective roles and authorities are completely different. Broad spectrum firearms classification is not a duty which falls under the authority of the Registrar in the Firearms Act. And if that's the case, then what exactly does Harper's Firearms Records Regulation actually do? And this is effectively what Trudeau's order in council for today says. So it says, the regulations repealing the Firearms Records Regulations remove the requirements for the Registrar of Firearms regarding the record-keeping of classification determinations made under the Firearms Act. Given the legal framework governing the classification of firearms, the regulations have had no effect on the assessment or classification of firearms in Canada, nor have records been created or maintained pursuant to the regulations. The repeal, therefore, removes an unnecessary regulation. And I'll put a link to today's OIC in the description down below so you can have a look at it for yourself if you want to see what it says specifically. But essentially, it's a bunch of wordy legal jargon which says that the Registrar isn't involved with the Firearms Reference Table or the Specialized Firearms Support Service, and therefore it isn't involved in the classification of firearms. And since neither the Registrar nor the Firearms Act are involved in the classification of firearms specifically, the regulation has no practical effect. And it goes on to say that the Registrar of Firearms has not created or maintained records related to the classification of firearms pursuant to the Firearms Records Regulations. Which means that this Order in Council does absolutely nothing, right? Like, after all, if the Firearms Records Regulations affect a power that the Registrar doesn't actually have and isn't actually using, then repealing these regulations shouldn't actually affect anything. Makes perfect sense. But of course, this is the morally corrupt Liberal government we're dealing with, so nothing is ever as simple and straightforward as that. If it were true that the Registrar has no such power, then why did Harper's government back in 2014 even bother implementing the Firearm Records Regulations in the first place? I mean, at the very least, it implies that the Harper government believed that the Registrar has such powers of classification, even though there's no specific mention of it in the legislation of the Firearms Act. And know who else believes the Registrar has powers governing firearms classification? The RCMP. In the 2022 report from the Commissioner of Firearms, on page 11, it very clearly says that the Registrar is responsible for overseeing certain aspects of the Firearms Act and has the authority to, quote, verify the accuracy of firearms classification information, end quote. And it also says that the Registrar has the authority to identify and classify a particular firearm as an antique firearm, according to this report. And you know where else it says the Registrar has the authority to classify firearms? This regulation that describes how the Registrar is to register a firearm and how to go about creating a registration certificate. And this directly pertains to the Firearms Act, going all the way back to 1998, shortly after the Firearms Act itself was enacted. Maintaining the Canadian Firearms Registry is the primary job of the Registrar. And the way the Registrar administers the registry is through the issuance and recording of registration certificates. Before a registration certificate can be issued, the Registrar must verify the identification and classification of the firearm. And only after verifying your firearm can registration certificates be issued. The Registrar is also permitted to assign individuals as verifiers, but it is still under the jurisdiction of the Registrar, and these verifiers are directly responsible for identifying and classifying firearms. And this has been the case for over 20 years now. However, since its inception, the Registrar's authority has been slowly watered down by the existence of the totally not legally binding Firearms Reference Table. Nowadays, part of the verification process from the Registrar literally requires a Firearms Reference Table number in addition to the normal classification information. And this is yet further evidence to show just how definitely not legally binding the Firearms Reference Table has become over the years. The RCMP insists it's just an administrative resource, and that it has no legal effect, that it exists merely to assist officials responsible for the regulation of firearms, that the Criminal Code, the Firearms Act, and other regulations are the prevailing authority when it comes to firearms classification, and that the Firearms Reference Table is simply the opinion of their in-house experts. Yet even the Registrar has become subject to its rule. Even though firearms classification lands squarely within the domain of firearms registration, and therefore is the sole discretion of the Registrar, even the Registrar appears to be required to adhere to the Firearms Reference Table these days. Not legally binding? Get real! Back to today's OIC. So I've shown that the Registrar is very clearly involved in classifying firearms, yet the Liberals are claiming with this OIC that the Registrar isn't involved in firearms classification, and that classification is instead determined somehow by the absolutely not legally binding Firearms Reference Table. Not only is that claim legally and factually inaccurate, but they intentionally deceived the intended purpose of Harper's Firearms Records Regulations back in 2014. The purpose was for the Registrar to keep a record of the determinations that the Registrar was making. Not to say that only the Registrar could make classification determinations, or to have a record made of all classification determinations. So when today's OIC says that the Registrar has not created or maintained records related to the classification of firearms, that may even be true, but they mean that in the broad scope of overall firearms classifications like the Firearms Reference Table does and the regulatory ban lists aim to achieve. But in reality, every time the Registrar has created a registration certificate, they have determined a firearms classification. Like, it's baked into the process. There is no way the Registrar could not have been making these determinations, and there's no way that the Registrar should not have records of this. And knowing this, the Liberals appear to have colored their order with a substitute explanation of what these records could be in order to downplay what they're really after. And this also narrows down very specifically what they could be after. Harper's Firearms Records Regulation only really does three things. First off, it ensures that only the Registrar can keep or amend records related to firearms classification determinations made under the Firearms Act. Secondly, it ensures that records must be made of these determinations. And third, it ensures that these records cannot be altered a year after they're made, and they can never be destroyed. Which means we know that the Liberals must either want to alter or destroy these records, and they're going to circumvent the Registrar to do it. Given that the next promised round of impending gun bans is coming in the next month or two, their goal seems rather obvious. But how they're going to use this to get them there remains to be seen. And this must be true, because, after all, if it were true that there are no such records, and that these regulations are serving no actual purpose, then why are the Liberals suddenly going out of their way to break the law in order to rush the repeal of this regulation on the eve of yet another gun ban? And yes, you heard that right. The Liberals, once again, violated the law to enact this order in council, albeit for a completely different reason as compared to their gun ban list OICs. And unlike the unlawful gun ban OICs done through the criminal code, today's OIC was done through provisions in the Firearms Act. And said provisions very clearly give them the authority to repeal the Firearms Records Regulation if they want to. No doubt about it, that's not up for debate. However, being that this is from the Firearms Act, there are certain procedures that they must follow in order to bring regulations into force. That procedure is detailed in Section 118 of the Firearms Act, and the procedure requires them to wait for the regulation to go through a committee process or wait 30 sitting days before the regulations can become active. And considering the political state of things in Canada here right now, it seems possible, if not likely, that there will be either a prorogation of Parliament or a non-confidence vote triggering an election shortly after Parliament resumes in January here. Meaning that it's unlikely a committee could ever get their work done before then. And that committee couldn't even start until Parliament resumes. Now, 30 days on the other hand doesn't sound too long, and that would be January 14th, which is 30 days from the start of these regulations when they were unlawfully enacted on December 16th. However, it's not 30 days, it's 30 sitting days. Looking at the House of Commons calendar, 30 sitting days takes us to April 4th. Again, they cannot wait that long, especially if they plan to ban more guns no later than February, something which they have already committed to doing. But, like any good dictatorship, there are legal loopholes and workarounds for when the law becomes inconvenient for the government. The exceptions the Liberals used this time around is found in Section 119 subsection 2 of the Firearms Act, and it says, "A regulation made under Section 117 may be made without being laid before either House of Parliament if the federal minister is of the opinion that the changes being made by the regulation to an existing regulation are so immaterial or insubstantial that Section 118 should not be applicable in the circumstances." And if we look at today's order in council, that language very clearly shows up in the OIC itself at the very top of the regulations. And it's also furthered by the language in the REIS, which is attached to the order. And it says that the repeal removes an unnecessary regulation, and that the regulations have not had any practical consequence. But, as with the unlawful use of the gun ban powers, the effectiveness of the regulation is not the test. Even if the Firearms Records Regulation actually did absolutely nothing at all, that alone is not a valid reason to use this exception. The test isn't whether or not the regulation itself is immaterial or insubstantial. The test is whether or not the change to an existing regulation is immaterial or insubstantial. A complete repealment of a regulation is hardly a minor change. Like, such a blatant misinterpretation of their powers could never hold up in court, but it doesn't have to. Trudeau and his corrupt Liberal Party have figured out that they don't need to follow the rules. There's no punishment for breaking them. Even if anyone had the funds or the interest to pursue this in court, it would take years before it was ever heard. And the Liberals are absolutely not going to be in power that long, and they don't need years for the benefit of this action to take effect. And if they're intending to destroy or alter records, which seems pretty likely, then it won't even take them days, let alone years, to do it. And there won't be any punishment for them even if or when this is overturned. So even though they aren't legally allowed to do what they're doing, there's absolutely nothing stopping them from doing it anyway. And we saw this as well in the unlawful use of the Emergencies Act. A court of law eventually found it to be an unlawful use of powers years after the fact, but it did everything the Liberals wanted it to do. And there was no punishment for them of any kind then either. In fact, they somehow ended up garnering more power as a result of the illegal use of their powers. And it's even looking probable that the Federal Court of Appeals will also overturn the Liberals' unlawful use of the gun ban powers in the coming weeks here. Because things actually went surprisingly well for the CCFR and friends at the Federal Court of Appeals, I think. But even if they did do such a thing, there would also be no punishment for the Liberals or Trudeau then either. Not even a slap on the wrist. I'm even of the mind that the Liberals had known from the get-go that the use of their gun ban OIC powers was unlawful from the start. And they knew it was never going to hold up in court. I've kind of been working on a video like that for a while now, but it's a little speculative, and I'm not sure it's ever going to see the light of day. But this could even be the hidden purpose of today's repealment in the first place. And it might be that they want to be able to reinterpret and reclassify existing firearms to, somehow, ban them outside the scope of the powers they know they will soon no longer have even an unlawful access to in Section 117.15 of the Criminal Code. But maybe not. It could very simply be that the Liberals were going over some previous firearms information by the Registrar and they encountered evidence which could hurt their desire to ban certain firearms in the near future. Or maybe it's possibly something which could have hurt them in future court cases, so they decided to destroy the information. And it could also be that they plan to plant information by altering some of these records in order to shore up some manufactured artificial support as to why they ought to ban certain firearms in the near future. Who knows? They could do a lot of stuff with this. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below, because there's plenty of options for this one, and I'm not sure I'm seeing all the angles here. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.